Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone across the globe joining us today. This is Jared from Acquian. Today's webinar is Best Practices for Migrating to Drupal with Maggie Schroeder and Stephanie Bridges from Acquian. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any audio issues, please send them into the Q&A tab and I will assist you. If you have any questions for the presenters, please submit them in the Q&A tab as well, and they will answer them at the end of the presentation. Slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted to acquian.com and also sent to you via email within the next few days. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Steph.
Thanks, Jared. My name is Stephanie Bridges. I'm a senior Drupal developer here at Acquian in professional services, and one of my passions is getting people into Drupal. And I serve as one of the Migrate references for our internal organization.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. And my name is Maggie Schroeder. This is my voice. I'm a product marketing manager here at Acquian, and I actually cover Acquian Cloud. I've been working with Steph over the past couple weeks to develop this content. I'm really excited to be bringing her into this webinar and all of the Drupal expertise that she's bringing with her as it pertains to migrating into Drupal. So with that, I'm actually going to kick us off with a poll. So our poll today is going to be, finding out which CMS you're currently leveraging today. So in just a moment, that's going to pop on up onto your screen, and you'll actually be able to vote. So, we've got a couple choices here: Adobe AEM, Sitecore, maybe WordPress. Maybe you have no CMS at all, and you're just leveraging static HTML, maybe multiple, or maybe other. So, we'd love to hear what you're leveraging today and what that looks like. Very cool. All right. Awesome. So it looks like we've got a couple options over here. We've got Drupal coming in. We love to see that over here at Acquian. I think this is great. So we actually structured out our webinar today so it'll appeal to a multitude of audiences beyond just Drupal. So if you are one of those who selected multiple or other, we have quite a few votes there as well. We are really excited to be presenting our webinar today to you on migrations. And so without further ado, let's kick it on off. So really the step one that we identified for executing a Drupal migration, whether that be migrating from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 or migrating from a different CMS such as WordPress, or again, maybe no CMS like an HTML based delivery, is really identifying what are your business goals in migrating. And so we have a couple questions that just popped up. So I'll just populate these on the screen. But Steph, I'd love to hear from your perspective when you're talking to customers about their Drupal migrations. What are the key questions? Maybe they are the ones up on the screen, but that you really work with customers to think about when they're executing a migration to Drupal.
Well, one of the first things that would affect a migration would be the multilingual capabilities. There's special things that you need to do if you do have multilingual content that you want to bring in.
Yeah.
What kind of content you have? Do you have a lot of structured content that you're going to be moving from into your Drupal, which is should be fairly structured? Or do you have a lot of non-structured content, but you would like to make it be structured? So basically, I'd like to start people off with thinking about what their current content looks like and where they want their content to go is probably the biggest questions that I would have for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the organization, so Steph, when you're working with customers, who typically do you have them involved within their organization? I know that we have one of the questions up there, who in your organization will be interacting with the CMS? So who do you typically would say, would you want to involve in these conversations when you're talking about your migration?
Well, obviously you'll need a business owner, but it's nice to have a fairly technical product owner so that they can help identify the strategies that we're going to implement and be a part of that.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. So yeah, we of course have a couple of these questions up on the board, but it's obviously going to be, it'll vary per organization. So I would say that, and you know, Steph, of course, you are the expert on this, but as you go through this, just keep in mind, you know, what are your business goals for your migration, and make sure that you're syncing with everyone in your organization who will be interacting with your CMS in order to better inform your migration strategy overall. Cool. So step 2, you know, I hinted at this a little bit, but from here you have to determine your migration strategy. And we have a couple options, and again, I'm going to lean on Steph here because she's gone through quite a few of these migrations, and that's an understatement in itself. So I'm going to lean on her, but you know, one of these models is a lift and shift. And Steph, can you kind of like walk through, you know, what a lift and shift work or looks like, and you know, who the typical customer profile, you know, what you would really, you know, what are some of the criteria if you're going to execute a lift and shift migration?
Well, there are a couple of things that would be attractive. First one might be if you have a Drupal 7 site and you want to move to Drupal 8, you may just want to, for starters, recreate what you have in 7 in 8 if it's working for you. You know, if you want to keep your current branding, that's another option for when you might want to do lift and shift. You know, if your currently implemented feature set satisfies your business needs and you don't really have a lot of new business needs other than, and this is again really probably directed mostly for Drupal 7, is you just want to get onto the latest supported version of Drupal. Another one might be if you're going to move from a static HTML site to Drupal, you may want to start as a first step, what we call MVP, to just move your unstructured content into Drupal pages, and then from there you can iterate on your content model and move to a more structured data set.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great outline of what a lift and shift would look like. And you gave quite a couple good customer profiles. And I think we had a lot of Drupalists in the audience. So definitely a good one to keep in mind for those Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 migrations. And so of course the next logical option, right, is reinventing your site. So really starting from new. So Steph, I'd love to hear, you know, again, just your kind of breakdown of what this looks like and who this would be the best fit for.
Well, if you're coming to Drupal because your current site isn't really working for you, you want to do a whole brand refresh. So you want a whole new look and feel, a brand new theme. You're going to restructure a lot of your content. Maybe you've done some analytics, say with Google Analytics, and you've determined that, oh, about 2/3 of the content that I have out here is old and stale, and I don't really want to keep it, and nobody ever looks at it. This is a great time to reinvent things and generate new content that's going to be more relevant to your audience than what you currently have.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'm actually, so I'm getting a question in right now too. Do you think that this would also be a fit? So I know in the first instance, I guess they're referring to, for a lift and shift, you referred to a D7 to D8 migration being a good fit. Do you think this would also be a good fit for a D7 to D8 migration in some cases?
It could be. I think the biggest thing that you want to think about if you're going to decide whether you want to just move your site over more or less as is, or if you want to reinvent it, is my content relevant to my current business goals? And if not, then this is a really great time to decide, well, what content really needs to come over and how should I structure it, and maybe you know, a whole brand refresh of everything is the way to go.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great segue too into our next section. So step 3 that we outline for a migration to Drupal, or in this case, sometimes Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 migration, is mapping out your migration. And Steph, you've done a lot of, you've brought up content a lot. So naturally, content modeling is one of the first steps that we want to talk through. So Steph, I'd love to give you the floor here to kind of talk through what content modeling looks like from start to finish.
Okay. And one thing I want to reiterate up front with this is, don't shortcut this step. You're going to have a much more successful migration if you take the time to do this first initial analysis. But some of the things that you need to analyze with your current content model beyond just, is it working for me or not, is, you know, how structured is it? You'll need to look a little bit about how you're going to get your data out, but we'll talk more about that later. Do you have taxonomy? Is it used to classify your site? Is that how you organize your site? Maybe you do some kind of a navigation by taxonomy. Going through and documenting your fields and what kinds of values they can hold, identify things that may or may not be something that is immediately available in Drupal. Your content authors, do you need to maintain content authors? Do you need to bring your users over? Or is this something where you have a small set of admin users that you can just create them new accounts and it doesn't have to be brought over? Do you need to keep your revision history? Do you have a lot of multilingual content? How is that structured? Is it standalone content? Or is it, in the Drupal sense, a translation of an existing piece of default language content? Do you have a lot of content that's got embedded images and documents in it, say body text with images in it? You'll need to be able to bring all those over. So yeah, there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it sounds like there's definitely a multitude there, and it sounds like you covered a lot of it. As you know, you outline this content model. Would you say that there are, you know, best practices for how to record that kind of the current and new content model as far as mapping that goes?
The easiest way is probably just start with an Excel spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. List off your different kind of content. You could make a tab in a spreadsheet for each of your main types of content that you want to surface. List off perhaps some examples of those pages so that you have something to go back to, especially when you're starting to develop your new content model. And one of the things there is, don't be tempted just to reiterate what you've already got. Think about what your needs really are, and worry about how to map old to new after the fact.
Awesome. Are there any like tools out there that are already available for, you know, documenting your content model?
Oh, funny you should ask. A fellow Acquian, as part of a project, developed something that he calls the Drupal Spec Tool, which is a set of tools that's powered by a Google spreadsheet that allows you to define in Drupal terms your Drupal content model. So you can create all of your bundles, which are the different types of content like events, articles, blog posts, etc. And define the fields for each one of those content types, all the way down to saying this field should have this machine name, it's this type of field, it's required, it can be translated, I need to migrate it. And then there are additional tools that you can use as part of your ongoing development that provide a way to create some automated tests to validate that what you've documented is what you have.
Awesome. And so that kind of goes into a little bit of our next topic, right? So content mapping. So I'd love to jump in here too on, you know, how that documentation really lends to, as well as, you know, not just the modeling, but also mapping to your existing content as well, your existing rather to your new.
Yeah, so the analysis that you've previously done is going to be directly used to create your actual migration scripts with the content modeling. So one of the first things you need to do is determining how you're going to access your legacy data, because you may not be able to access it directly from your new Drupal site. So there may be some steps that you need to get your data out of your existing database. Another thing you'll need to do is determine content dependencies. So if you do have related images or taxonomy terms or users or anything like that that you need, that your content needs to reference, you'll need to pull those in. And so using the documents that you created previously, you can map those. There is a tab in the Drupal Spec Tool that allows you to create mappings. And a mapping is really just, where's the data coming from? Where's it going to? And do I need to do any steps, intermediate steps along the way to get the data from the source format into the proper destination format?
Awesome. So I think that this really was a pretty good dive into content modeling and mapping. And I know, you know, as Steph and I were walking through this presentation, there's a lot more we could talk about when it comes to content. I think it sounds like this Drupal Spec Tool is a great place to start when you're thinking about looking at you know, mapping and modeling your current content, how it exists in today's world, and then how it will eventually exist as you migrate. And so with that, you know, a logical, again, next step here is, you know, what about external services? What about things, and again, for those of you who might be coming from a different CMS other than Drupal, something that, you know, we wanted to point your attention to, right, is you might have services that you are leveraging today that you want to use in Drupal tomorrow. Drupal's an awesome community, and there are over 44,000 free contributed modules in Drupal today. So that's a lot to choose from to, again, execute on these external services. And Steph, I guess I'd have you hop in here. You know, what are some examples of typical external services that you see customers really looking to leverage?
Things like if you do have some external APIs that you need to consume to show data, there's also how are you doing search, Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, any kind of personalization tools that you might be wanting to leverage if you have an e-commerce solution. Maybe you need your site to talk back to your company's Salesforce. And then there's also single sign-on for customers that need to do that. You need to investigate how all of those things would work. And then are you doing anything in the decoupled realm? Do you need to provide your content via an API that other sites or applications might be accessing?
Awesome. And, you know, you mentioned search, Google Analytics, some personalization tools and e-commerce. Are these all external services that you've worked with customers to implement previously?
With most of them, yes. And for most of those things, there is a module for that. So, you know, your first choice would be to check on Drupal.org for contributed modules that will support your needs. Most of the time they are there.
That's awesome. It's kind of like Apple's, there's an app for that. In Drupal, it's like there's a module for that. That's fun. Awesome. So next step, we obviously don't want to forget about design. So there's theming, and Steph, I know you've walked through this a couple times, so there are some best practices. Can you shed a little insight onto, what best practices when it comes to approaching theming are?
Well, first I would get your design people involved and create some wireframes and mock-ups and share those with whoever's going to be developing your theme, and get that started early on and get feedback from your product owners to make sure that they're all on board with that. And then there are a lot of contributed Drupal themes that you can use as a starting point, depending on what, if you have some existing expertise with some kind of theming frameworks, there's probably a base theme there that you can use as a starting point that implements that, like Bootstrap or Foundation, some of those things. And also, Maggie has some other talk about how you can enable more non-technical teams.
Yeah, thanks, Steph, for queuing me up. So yes, as a marketer myself, so I do work on our product marketing team, and so as much as I'm a little bit more technical than some of my marketing counterparts, I still wouldn't say that I'm a Drupal expert by any means. I'm still only, a year into that knowledge. So one of the products that I love in the Acquia suite, and just plugging this in here, of course, for those of you who have non-technical team members, maybe your marketing counterparts who you want to enable, I would definitely urge you to check out Cohesion. They have a sandbox that you can go online and you can test it out. It's a really powerful tool for, again, those non-technical members of your team. So I would just say, if you are looking to evaluate low-code options for theming your Drupal site, specifically for migrating from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. That's a great use case. I would definitely look into that, and we'll make sure that we include a link to how you can get a demo environment up and running at the end of this call. So yeah, and with that, we've talked a lot about planning for your migration. We talked about identifying your business needs. We talked about making sure that you determine your migration strategy and get that all set, and then mapping your migration from both a content standpoint, external services, and then of course theming. So the next step is developing and actually executing on your migration. And so once again, you have a couple options. So the first option for executing your migration is going through an incremental migration. This might be called other things, but essentially this is it's in the name, migrating your site from either Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, or maybe another CMS like WordPress to Drupal incrementally. So a little bit at a time. So, Steph, I know that you have some experience here, and that this isn't necessarily the most typical migration path for most customers, but I'd love to hear, some insight into, what this looks like and some of the requirements for customers who choose this path.
Yeah, well, the first thing you're going to need for this is you're going to need the some kind of edge infrastructure that will allow you to say, when your customer comes to your domain, that content in this path goes to the Drupal site and content at this path goes to your legacy site. That can lead to some complications with, you need to make sure that you're not serving the wrong content. So you don't want to accidentally send them to the legacy site when they should be going to Drupal, because they're going to be getting stale content. Most people don't do this. Sometimes there is the desire to say you're even going to change your hosting to a new URL. You might be able to operate it that way, but you're still going to need some kind of infrastructure in place to make sure that they are getting served the right content. When you would do this is if you have some content that you can easily migrate over and get some quick wins with having them on the new platform, but you have some other content that may require custom development for, or maybe you're moving that to something else that you're going to have Drupal surface via an API, but that API is not ready yet. Those would be times when you might want to consider this. But like I said, it's most of our customers probably aren't doing this. If you have a lot of sites, you may want to do something where you move one site at a time, and then that's a much easier incremental type migration where you pull an entire site over at a time, but you have a lot of them, and then you would do those one at a time.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially that second use case of migrating a whole site at a time. It sounds like almost an abbreviated version of an incremental migration, and leads a little bit into, migrating all at once, where it's not, obviously this theoretical customer that we're referring to would have multiple sites, but they're migrating one site all at once, then the next site all at once. And so that goes into our next migration strategy, which is migrating sites all at once. So Steph, you did a great job unpacking the last one. I'd love to hear you unpack, what this looks like, and any considerations you think that those on the call today should have when executing this type of migration.
Oh, sure, thanks. So, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about here applies to the previous one also, because you're going to actually develop your migration scripts and test them and validate them no matter which strategy you're using. But you'll want to take those content mappings and use those to develop your migration scripts. In Drupal, a migration is defined by a YAML file. So you would create your migrations where you have your source and then your mappings, and then you tell it where to save that to. So you test your migrations, and this is an iterative process. And during development, you can just roll everything back and start over until you've gone through and you've got your content coming in properly. I think it's good to have your content editors be heavily involved in this, as far as validating that, yes, the content's coming over the way it should, and I'm seeing the right things in the right places, because they're the ones with the institutional knowledge to know what that content should be. It's also a great way to get them familiar with the Drupal admin UI, so they start to get up to speed on how to add and edit content in Drupal. You'll need to remind them during the testing phase that none of this is going to be live. But once you get to the point where you feel like your migrations are working properly, you can run those in your new production environment. And then if there are any manual cleanup steps that they've identified, those can start happening. And once you've done that, you can't roll those migrations back anymore. And you shouldn't be trying to update any migrated content. So if they make updates on the live site to content that they've started cleaning up on the new site, they'll have to duplicate those efforts. Hopefully it isn't a lot, and it isn't for a long period of time. Another thing that you want to do during this time is identify any redirects that you're going to need. If your URLs are not changing, this is not going to be a big deal, but often when you're moving to Drupal from some other CMS, your URLs are going to end up changing. And so you'll need to account for that.
Awesome. That was great. So yeah, Steph, I think you walked into a few things that would lead logically to an official launch. You mentioned that, you know, once you're satisfied that your migrations are working properly, and they can be run on your new production site. So that at that point, content editors are going to, you know, start making those. They're going to begin those manual cleanup steps that you were referring to, and naturally after that, you're going to want to implement a content freeze so that you know that, you know, again, you've set a date for this launch and that your content editors aren't making any more updates on the production site. So I don't know if you want to walk through, you know, some best practices for setting a content freeze and some of the other considerations around a content freeze once again you just decide to launch your new site.
So, you know, first, I think you want to set a target date for launch. And once you've set that date and you set a content freeze date, and you can use your best judgment on how long that needs to be, maybe based on the amount of cleanup that you do have and how often content is updated on your current production site. If you don't have a lot of content updates on a regular basis, you can obviously make your content freeze much shorter. Ideally, you don't want it to be, I would say, a week, just because it's, you know, you don't want, if you're used to updating your current production site really regularly, you don't want to suddenly just stop updating it. So that's one consideration. So set your content freeze, get your final migration run to pull in any new content since the last time you've run it, and have your content editors make all those last minute changes that they need to, and then you'll be ready to go live.
Awesome. Love it. It sounds easy, but I'm sure it's a little bit more complex than that. But, you know, Steph, you're making it sound easy for everyone on the phone today. Gotta love it. So yeah, after, you know, you go through that launch that seems fairly easy, of course, probably not in practice, but hopefully after implementing, you know, the planning, you'll get there. The next step is optimizing. We always want to make sure that we're iterating on our sites. So whether it be Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, and making sure that you're optimizing your Drupal 8 site in preparation for the much anticipated Drupal 9, or, you know, maybe you're migrating again from another CMS to Drupal 8. Same goes there, right? Making sure that you're continuously optimizing. So Steph, can you walk through, we have a couple up here on the screen, but some of the optimizations that those on the phone might want to consider once they are finally launched?
Yeah, and some of these you can be doing ahead of time, but you'll need to pay attention to them around your launch time. So any SEO considerations, content meta tags, any of those kinds of header information that appears that search engines will use to make sure they can crawl your site effectively, creating a new sitemap, making sure that's ready to go when on launch day. Redirects, there's a redirect 404 module that Drupal provides that allows you to go through and look at all the 404s that you're getting. And it gives you a quick way to create a redirect to the new content. So if you've missed something in your migration, and you pretty much always will, you can find those and remediate them fairly quickly that way. It'll tell you how many times this 404 happened, and so you can sort that so that you can get your worst offenders first and work through that. But those are things that you know, you can start a little bit ahead of time, but you probably really won't be able to do the final thing until you're actually really serving your content from your new site.
Awesome. Yeah, those are definitely all definitely great considerations to have. And obviously a huge part of migrating to, especially, you know, some of you on the phone, a lot of you seem like you're familiar, at least with Drupal, but for those of you who are not, and I would say I'm still in that boat, just being a year in, there are so many resources out there. Drupal's such an amazing community. I know Steph's been part of it for quite a while. I myself only a year, but I found that, you know, everyone in the community is really willing and open to help out. There are tons of forums you can find online, a couple of them that we'll send you in the follow-up that you can check into. And of course, this photo in the background here was taken at DrupalCon, so you can just see, you know, how active and involved the community is in making sure Drupal's great. And, you know, on that, Steph, you've had more experience with the community than me. What would you say are the most valuable resources within the community that you've found in helping educate your teams when it comes to migrations?
Well, the documentation on Drupal.org is actually really good. There are some sample modules in some of the contrib migrate modules that everybody installs. Those are good. For your more technical people, maybe they have some Drupal experience, but they just haven't used migrate yet. All the code is really, really well documented. So, you know, if you learn by reading code, that's a great choice. And also, I just Google, because people, if you have a problem with Drupal or a question about something with Drupal, chances are somebody else has, and they've written about it. So there's a lot of information on the internet, just you can glean from just general Google searches.
Awesome. Yeah, and Steph too, I'll also say to everyone online, you know, Acquia has a ton of in-house Drupal experts. So, you know, if you were considering becoming part of the Acquia family, we offer tons of PS services, such as, like, you know, Drupal trainings, and they don't even have to be migrate specific. And Steph is obviously been part of quite a few Drupal migrations and helping our customers to architect out their Drupal migrations and execute those from start to finish while implementing best practices. So we've got a ton of expertise in-house as well, if you were considering becoming part of the Drupal family. And beyond just being part of, the Acquia family, and beyond that as well, on Acquia.com, we do have tons of resources, you know, ebooks, webinars, what have you, that help with a lot of aspects of, you know, really creating the best experiences for your customers, leveraging Drupal. So with that, just in review, right, just walking back through what we talked about today on the call, our first step that we talked about was identifying your business goals. And I think Steph did a really good job going back to this, that, you know, during the subsequent stages, if you had identified clear business goals, it makes it a lot easier to, you know, determine what kind of migration strategy you'd elect. When you're mapping your migration, figuring out how to model your content to best achieve those business goals, as well as identifying what kind of external services that you need to be leveraging. And then once you move into the ultimate launch, so launch being a one-time exercise, there's obviously that continuous optimization, development, and execution to make sure that your site isn't only great on day one, but also you continue to iterate to make that you know, the best it can be. And so I mentioned a couple times throughout this call that we've talked a lot throughout about all these resources that are out there. Keep an eye out for a follow-up email that'll be sent from us. We want to make sure that all of these resources are in your hands so that you know exactly where to go if you need additional help. And obviously, you know, Acquia is always here to support as well. And so with that, that actually concludes our webinar today. Thank you all for coming, and we're going to open it up now for a couple questions. I know I saw a couple come through the chat as we were walking through the actual webinar, but I'd love to kick it off now with, so we've got a couple questions here. The first one's about And Steph, I'm not sure if you went into this, but talking about if today in your current content model or the way that you model content, you've got a ton of images in your body content. What does that look like when you migrate? Are there additional considerations that you have to make when you have that kind of content type?
Yeah, there is. This is probably one of the tougher problems. Because you'll need to, as part of your migration step, parse through the HTML markup and pull all those images and files into Drupal and create appropriate links to them so that your end users aren't stuck with broken links for things. One other thing that you might be able to do is configure your site to recreate your URLs. If you can move your files into the same place that they were before, you can maybe modify your URL so that it knows to look in the Drupal file space, which adds additional paths to your image URL, so that it can look there. But in general, you'll want to take some time to do that, as far as, making sure you get all those in. And that's another area where it's important to have your content editors go through and validate that, yes, all the image links and the file links are going to work. And if you have some way of pulling out a list of all those ahead of time, and most people don't, you could theoretically copy those all over into Drupal at their current file path and then just refer to them in the migration. But most people end up having to copy those files as part of their content migration on the fly. That's one of the harder aspects of the unstructured content route.
Awesome. So we've got another question coming in. How do you improve site performance after migration?
That's a good question. I think probably by making sure that you've got a good caching strategy set up. You've got, like, say, varnish or a CDN in front of your site to make sure that content that doesn't change very often is cached. And so it doesn't ever have to actually hit Drupal. Some of the best practices things you want to look at are more Drupal specific, where you're following best practices and paying attention to what kind of custom code you have. But one of the biggest things is just to minimize the amount of time that you have to come back to Drupal and hit the database.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. And then we had one more question. So when it comes to what you guys referred to as an incremental migration, you talked about edge infrastructure. Is that referring specifically to a CDN?
It can be. It needs to be something like, I know Akamai allows you to do this, where you can set up a rule set that says, when I see this path, I direct it to this backend. If I see this other path, I believe Acquia Edge also allows you to do this.
Yep, I was about to chime in and say Acquia Edge has the same solution as well. Yep.
Yeah, so it generally is a path-based approach. So you have to be careful how you structure your incremental site migration, so things you have as few rules as possible to deal with.
Definitely. And that would really be up to, making sure that you're very organized, right, Steph, in that kind of migration?
Yeah, you really want to do it in a section by section basis, or like I said, if if you're coming into Acquia Site Factory, say, where you have a lot of small sites, then you can do those one site at a time, and it's really more like a all-at-once migration per site. And so you can launch individual sites on the new platform really easily that way.
Got it. And I just had one question. I think this one will be quick, but we are almost at time here. The question was, it came up right after you mentioned Site Factory. It was said, we're considering Site Factory. Does that low code solution work with Site Factory? I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong in the questions, but that you're referring to Acquia Cohesion, which is the low code site builder that I mentioned for, more of a marketer, someone who's not as technical, or also of course someone technical if you feel like playing around with it. But yes, that is compatible with Site Factory. And keep an eye out. One of my counterparts in product marketing is actually coming out with an awesome ebook to talk about the benefits there. And so with that, I think we're at time. So I'll let Jared actually close this on out.
Cool. So thank you, Maggie and Stephanie. Thank you all again for attending our webinar today. As I said previously, the slides and recording of this webinar will be posted to acquia.com and sent to you via email within the next few days. If you have any additional questions, please send them to marketing@theacquiateam.com. Thanks again. Have a great day.